Welcome to Joseph and the Hyksos Pharaoh. And today we're going to look into the events leading up to the arrival of the children of Israel in the land of Egypt. The date of the Exodus was established as 1446 BC. Egypt then went through a period of 250 years where it was split into two parts, that being northern or lower Egypt and southern or upper Egypt. Lower Egypt was ruled, especially for the last 100 years, by non-Egyptians called the Hyksos, and they were known as the 14th and 15th dynasties of Egypt. Upper Egypt was ruled by what I'd call proper native or natural Egyptians, and their dynasties were known as the 13th, the 16th, and the 17th dynasties. And then during the latter half of the Hyksos 15th dynasty, there was repeated conflict that then began to arise between them and the 17th dynasty of natural Egyptians. And then finally in 1557 BC, after repeated conflicts and skirmishes, Amos, the final pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, so he was a natural Egyptian from the south, managed to finally defeat the Hyksos and expel them from Egypt and reunite all of Egypt once again. So we have both Upper and Lower Egypt once more united together to form a single Egypt. And this then became known as the 18th dynasty, and it was this line of pharaohs who came from Upper Egypt who did not know Joseph, as we read in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. Joseph and the children of Israel, you recall, arrived and settled in Lower Egypt during the Hyksos era and therefore developed no relationship with the Egyptians and specifically the pharaohs from Upper Egypt. And then lastly, we saw how the hatred and the fear that had built over time of the Hyksos and of them once they had been expelled returning to was what ultimately led to the enslavement of the children of Israel. And we again see this in two particular passages, the first one being Exodus chapter 1 and verse 2, where we read there, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them." So this is the natural Egyptians from Upper Egypt who have now expelled the Hyksos, taken over Lower Egypt, in which the children of Israel are living. Having expelled these Hyksos out, they are now the rulers, and they say, "Let us deal shrewdly with them," with the children of Israel, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies. Whose enemies? The Egyptians' enemies, who were the Hyksos. So lest they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. And then we read as well in Exodus 1 verse 12, "And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." So we can quite easily see why this situation arose and how the record in Scripture backs up what we find out in history. So with that quick recap, what we're going to look at during this talk is the following four key points. We're going to look at the exact length of time the children of Israel were in Egypt. We're going to, as part of this process, use it to give us the dates for the birth of Abraham, the birth of Isaac, the birth of Jacob, and even the birth of Joseph. We're going to look at how it was possible for 11 of Jacob's sons, so from his firstborn Reuben right the way through to Joseph, who was the 11th son, these are the ones that occurred before Benjamin, how it was possible for 11 of Jacob's sons to be born in a period of just 7 years. And that's not something we often read of or are aware of when reading Scripture, but that's what took place. And then fourthly and finally, we're going to look into more detail on the circumstances surrounding Joseph's role and the role he played in helping to establish that 15th dynasty of the Hyksos. And so hopefully these aspects, these 4 points that we're going to look at will have sufficiently whet your appetite. So let's dive in then and look at our first point, the exact length of time the children of Israel were in Egypt. And the time period from when Jacob and his family arrived in Egypt during the time of the 7-year famine, and we'll see later on, they arrived at the end of the second year of the start of the 7-year famine, until the Exodus in 1446 BC is generally very, very poorly understood. And this includes us as a community of Bible students. And granted, the wording at face value, when we read the various verses that allude to a possible time frame that the children of Israel were in Egypt, do indicate sort of varying points. The first one that we most often pick up with is this 400 years, and the 400 years we can pick up in passages like Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13 and Acts chapter 7 and verse 6. And then another common one is the 430-year period, and this is mentioned in Exodus 12 verses 40 to 41 and Galatians 3 and verse 17. But we all know that God expects us to be very much like the Bereans, and we're told of them by Luke in Acts chapter 7. Now, these Jews were more noble. Why? Than those in Thessalonica. They were more noble. Why? Because they received the word of God with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So they didn't just take things on face value. They delved into and studied and explored scripture, examining it daily to see whether these things were so. And so we can see from this that this is something God expects of us. He expects us to be noble, and He expects us to examine daily scripture to see what is true and what is not. So the moment we have this apparent surface contradiction that seems to indicate a sort of a stay of either 400 years or 430 years, we need to carefully examine things to resolve the issue. Is it 400? Is it 430? Or is it something else? So let's look closely at some of these and others to piece together the reality of what actually transpired. What was the actual period that the children of Israel spent in Egypt? And the first passage I want to go to is one that often gets dragged into the subject more because it has 400 years in it. And it was one that we dealt with in Talk 2. And it's this period of 480 years. And we read there in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So this is from the starting point of the Exodus. In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So we've been given this 480-year period starting this time from the Exodus, going forward to when Solomon began to build the temple. And you'll hopefully recall that we used this time period to work back from the well-recognized date that Solomon began the construction of the temple in 966 BC. So if we go from 966 BC backwards 480 years, it takes us to 1446 BC and gives us the date of the Exodus. Our next one we're going to look at is this 400-year period, and there's, as I said, two passages that really, when we read them at first glance, they really seem to clearly state that the children of Israel were enslaved or in Egypt for a total of 400 years. And the first one we're going to look at is from Genesis and occurs in the promises given to Abraham. So God gave them to Abraham as he made that covenant with him, and we read there, "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and will be afflicted 400 years. And this seems to be, at face value, an open and shut case, you'd say. Clearly from this passage, we're being told that the children of Israel will be sojourners and afflicted for 400 years in Egypt. But let's not jump to conclusions before we have examined this and other passages carefully to see what it is and what it isn't telling us. So first off, what is it telling us? It's telling us that Abraham's offspring, not Jacob's, Abraham's offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. So this must apply to Isaac and onwards. We can't leave Isaac out of the equation. It can't just apply to Jacob and Jacob's descendants. It is saying Abraham's offspring, so it has to include Isaac. So it's from Isaac onwards through Jacob all the way to those who finally came out of Egypt. And when we view it through this lens, I think it begins to start making a bit more sense. And we are told that they, Isaac, and his descendants as well, would be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, as you can see in that green in Genesis 15 and verse 13. And this aspect is really well spelt out in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9. We read there, by faith he went to live in the land of promise, and this is talking about Abraham. So by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. So included in this idea of being in a foreign land, and if you're in a foreign land, you're effectively a sojourner in a land that is not theirs. And included in this concept is both Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we read further in this, again in Hebrews, that these all died in faith. So we're talking Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and have acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And so once again, emphasizing this point that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants were strangers and exiles on the earth. So in other words, going back to Genesis 15, verse 13, they were sojourners in a land that is not theirs. They'd been promised this land, and it didn't matter where they were. They were still strangers in a land that is not theirs. Whether it was Canaan, Egypt, wherever they might have found themselves during that period, they were sojourners. Now, the part about being servants and afflicted needs to be looked at, and it needs to be understood when reading these two descriptions here of being servants and afflicted, is that they are describing aspects of what happened to them during that 400-year period, not what happened to them the entire time. And we read into it too much if we suddenly start saying that the entire 400 years had to be a period of being servants and afflicted. It's sort of what we read when we look at verse 13. There will be servants there and will be afflicted for 400 years. But I think we need to understand this as just descriptions of aspects or parts of the period of the 400 years. And remember that Joseph was alive for 71 years after the children of Israel arrived in Egypt. So 71 years, the very first 71 years as a given, we wouldn't dream of calling that period, at least, of being one of affliction, and in which the children of Israel were servants. Joseph was 2RC. He was their brother. He would have been looking after them. They were valued members within the community. They were given one of the best pieces of land to stay in. So straight away we know that at least 71 years, and maybe much more than that, we have to discount as being a period of being afflicted and servants. And so straight away we see this idea that the entire period must be defined by being servants and afflicted is false, and that this is just a description of a particular period in which they suffer affliction and being servants. So the 400 years needs to be understood as applying from Isaac right through to the Exodus, and as the period that they were sojourners, whether that this was, as I said, in Canaan, Egypt, or anywhere else. And the aspect of being servants and afflicted applies to the periods of time during the 400 years, and more specifically, the very end part when that new Pharaoh arose and obviously enslaved them and afflicted them, but not the entire period. Now, our second passage that we need to look at after this 400-year period comes from Acts chapter 7 and verse 6. And we looked at the idea of this 400 years, and we could clearly see that the period is there to govern from Isaac as the offspring of Abraham all the way through to the end of the Exodus. So when we come to the New Testament and we pick up this same 400-year period, we have to marry the two together and understand that these two passages are talking about exactly the same period. And so look at what we read in verse 6 of Acts chapter 7. And God spake to this effect, that his offspring, and again, this is talking about Abraham, his offspring, so from Isaac onwards, would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. And really just marrying exactly the same thing. We know in that period that they weren't enslaved and afflicted. Isaac wasn't, for sure. For most of Jacob's life, if not his entire life, he wasn't, and likewise with Joseph as well. So again, the affliction and enslavement, backed up both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, really just apply to parts of the period in which they were sojourners. And so again, the sojourners applies to the full period from the birth of Isaac all the way through to the Exodus. And again, note that it applies in point 1 there to Abraham's offspring from Isaac onwards. It's the land that belongs to others is not specifically meant to apply to Egypt, but anywhere they found themselves in the Middle East. That's anywhere Abraham with Isaac and Jacob, etc., found themselves in the Middle East, that any of that land, they were strangers or sojourners. And then again, this idea of being enslaved and afflicted, again, is a description of some part of the 400 years, not all of it. And the sojourning, however, we know covers all of that period. So the sojourning is 400 years. The enslavement and affliction parts are aspects of that, and more specifically towards the end. So if this 400-year period is applied to Isaac up until the Exodus, then we have the period given to us from 1446 BC, the date of the Exodus, back to the birth of Isaac, that being 400 years, and that would then take us to 1846 BC. And in addition, we know that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, and we told this in Genesis 21 verse 5, and so we have the date of his birth, and that would be 1946 BC. So Abraham born in 1946 BC, 100 years later in 1846 BC, Isaac is born, and then from Isaac's birth, 400 years later, the Exodus takes place. So our second, I wouldn't call it problem passage, but period that we need to deal with in the same manner that we've dealt with the 400 years is this 430 years. And again, at face value, how would we explain the contradiction between, or the apparent contradiction between the 400 years and the 430-year period? And how do we reconcile this period with our reasoning so far? And again, I believe with some careful inspection and pulling together some other verses, it all falls in place and we come to an interesting additional piece of information. And so our first passage to go to, Exodus chapter 12 and verses 40 to 41. And we read there, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And this verse really seems to be specific in stating that the entire time of the children of Israel living in Egypt was 430 years. But we must be misunderstanding what we are being told here. Otherwise, we have a major contradiction in Scripture. And fortunately, Paul helps us out and tells us what this 430 years actually represents. And look at what he says when he's writing to the Galatians in verse 17 of chapter 3. And he says, this is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. And that's seems like a bit of a weird way of saying things. But the first thing I think to take from these two passages, from Exodus chapter 12 and from Galatians chapter 3, is that we were talking about the same period. Both are talking about 430 years, and both are talking about ending at the same point. The children of Israel in Exodus chapter 12, we're told that they came out of Egypt after 430 years, and Paul says that the law was given at the end of the 430-year period. So the law, we know, was given when the Exodus took place. So we have two of the identical time periods, both ending on exactly the same point in time, that being the Exodus. And so they must then be talking about exactly the same thing. And so we need to then use what Paul has given us here to help us interpret not only Galatians 3, but Exodus chapter 12. So, piecing these two passages together, what have we got? We've got that the 430-year period ends at the Exodus, as we said. We see that the law was given to the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt, which is at the Exodus. So again, the same point in time. The covenant now, or promises given to Abraham, were given then, Paul is telling us, 430 years prior to the giving of the law. And so Paul here helps us understand where this 430-year period starts and how we need to try then and understand this verse and what this 430-year period actually means. So Paul is saying in summary that the 430-year period starts when the first promise was given to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees, and it ends when the law is given at the Exodus. So that's our 430-year period. Now, when we go and look at this verse 40 in the King James Version, I think it actually translates it a little bit clearer and probably, quite frankly, a lot better than what we've just seen in the ESV. And so we read in the King James, now the sojourning of the children of Israel, and we could almost see this as in brackets, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. So the sojourning, once again, of the children of Israel is this 430 years. And that who dwelt in Egypt is not the period they were in Egypt, but rather a descriptive of who these people are. They're identified as being those that also ended up in Egypt. And interestingly, when we go to the Septuagint, and I mean, I can't verify how accurate this actually is, but it's interesting in terms of its translation of this particular verse. And it adds an additional, I think, relevant and quite important piece of information. And we read there, the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Egypt. So the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers would include Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. And so we would have all of those fathers, the proper patriarchs, being incorporated in this particular verse. And again, if we actually go and look at the Samaritan version, it adds an additional piece of information, again, I think equally valid in terms of how they understood it. And we read that the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt. And again, that makes so much more sense. When Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees, he sojourned as a stranger in a foreign land, in the land of Canaan, sometimes down into Egypt. And so we go through Isaac and Jacob all the way through until their time period in Egypt. And so again, it makes a lot more sense, especially when we look at these two versions. So again, we are meant to understand that the sojourning is dealing with Canaan and Egypt. And in this particular case, Abraham himself is included in the sojourning, beginning from when he received the promises in Genesis chapter 12 in Ur of the Chaldees. And we need to remember that was where he first received these promises, and we see this first interaction in a way between Abraham and God. And so just reading this particular passage, or before we go and look at this in Genesis chapter 12, just looking at some verses just preceding this, because I think it helps give us an additional piece of information. So picking up in Genesis chapter 11 and verses 31 to 32, we read there, Terah, and Terah was Abraham's father. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So they leave Ur of the Chaldees. They stop over for a period in this place called Haran, and Terah eventually dies there at the age of 205 years old. Now, reading chapter 12, after these verses, I think we can conclude that Abraham stayed in Haran until his father Terah died, and only then did he leave at the age of 75 years old. So Abraham had been tasked with leaving his family, as God had asked him to do. And so out of respect, I believe, for his old father at 200 years old, Terah, he probably suddenly became extremely frail and wasn't up to traveling at that age, and it's understandable. Out of respect to his father, Abraham stayed with him for a further 5 years until he died in Haran. As soon as he died, Abraham continued with what God had asked him to do, and he upped and offed and went to the land of Canaan. And I believe that we pick this up in Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house," so leave Terah, which he eventually does do, "to the land that I will show you." And going a little bit further on to verse 4, Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So again, we're jumping forward. Abraham receives these promises in the beginning of Genesis chapter 12. He then goes with Terah to Haran, stays there for a period of time, and at the age of 75 years old, Terah dies at 205, and then Abraham eventually leaves. And I think this leads us to conclude, when we piece all of this information together, that if the 400-year period started when Abraham was 100 years old, the promise to Ur must have been given to Abraham when he was 70 years old, because remember, we had that 430-year period. So we had the 400 years from the Exodus to Isaac being born. The 430 years from the Exodus would take us to when Abraham is 70, and 70 is when the promise was given to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees. And it means then when he left with Lot and Sarah and Terah to go to Haran, he must have been 70 at that point in time. He stayed there for a further 5 years until Terah was 205 and died, and he was 75 years old, as we read in Genesis 12 and verse 4. And at 75 years old, Abraham departs from Haran. And so when we lay this out in a graph, it looks like the following. And so we have from the green line coming downwards, so from the birth of Isaac at the green line down to the Exodus in 1446, we have this 400-year period. We have the 430 years from the promises given to Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees when he was 70 years old, all the way through to the Exodus. And then we have that 480-year period that we looked at from the Exodus down to the purple line, which is when Solomon began to build the temple in 966 BC. Now, one further date that we need to consider, just because, again, it also has this 400-year period in it, is the 450-year period. And it occurs in Acts chapter 13, and Paul raises it when addressing the Jews in Antioch. And what we read there is the following from Acts chapter 13 and verses 19 to 20. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. So notice what Luke tells us here as the writer of Acts is this word, and I've put it in bold and underlined and red, about 450 years. So it's not exactly 450 years. It's one of those plus or minus, fairly close to 450 years, I guess, is what Luke is saying to us. And what is he telling us here? He's saying that the land was finally, as promised to the children of Israel, the land was finally given to them in its entirety as the final kind of product just before the judges started, 450 years. So 450 years after they had been promised they would be given this land. And we know that that takes us back to the birth of Isaac. So we've got again that 400-year period from Isaac to the Exodus, and then there's this further 50 years up to this particular point. And can we break this 50 years down and establish it and understand it? And I believe we can. So the first thing that we read is Caleb saying the following to us in Joshua chapter 14 and verses 7 to 10. And Caleb says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. So you recall that Caleb and Joshua went with 10 other spies to go and spy out the land. And they did that in the second year, having come out of the Exodus. So this was 2 years after the Exodus that they went out. And Caleb is saying at that point in time, he was 40 years old. And then he goes on and says, but now I'm this day 85 years old. So what are we being told in all these different passages? Well, Caleb was 40 years old, as I said, in the second year after leaving Egypt. Therefore, he would have been 38 years. It would have been 38 years later that he entered the promised land. They were in the wilderness for an entire period of 40 years after the Exodus. But this obviously occurred after 2 years, so a further 38 years to get to the point of entering the promised land. That would then make Caleb 78 years old at this point in time. But we saw that he was 85 years old after conquering the promised land, as we read in Joshua chapter 14. So again, with some quick maths, we can see 85 less our 40 plus 38, our 78 gives us 7 years. So it took the children of Israel under Joshua 7 years to conquer the land and get it under control as God had commanded them to do so. And at that point now, Caleb says he is 85 years old. Now, if we assume, and this is an assumption, and again, I think it fits in with this this plus minus that Luke gives us in Acts chapter 13. If we assume, let's say, a further 3 years to mark out and divide up and give out the various parcels of land to the different tribes and to the various people within each tribe, and I don't think that's unreasonable to expect it to take a further maybe 3 years to carry out that particular process. Then we would have the 7 years of conquering the land, the 3 years of marking and dividing out, etc. of the land, a total of 10 years. The 10 years plus the 40 years in the wilderness gives us a total of 50 years from the start of the Exodus all the way through to the start of the Judges, and to that point at which the land has been entirely given out to the children of Israel. And so again, with our 400 years from the Exodus being back to Isaac's birth, we have 450 years from Isaac's birth until finally that promise is delivered on and they are finally given the land at the end of 450 years. And I think when we look at it that way, we can now begin to see how neatly all these figures fit together if we correctly interpret what period they are in fact dealing with. And so again, we have the 400 years which we've dealt with. We have the 450 years that we've just looked at now, again from the same point where Isaac is born, but in this particular case, right through until the land is finally distributed out to all the children of Israel and the judge period begins. We have obviously our 430-year period taking us right back to the promise in Ur of the Chaldees to Abraham. And we have that 480 years taking us from the Exodus all the way through to Solomon beginning to build the temple in his 4th year. But all of this was meant to help us to arrive at a period of time that the children of Israel actually spent in Egypt. And for that, we need to tie together a few more verses. So the first one that we're going to use is from Genesis 21, verse 5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. We then have Isaac, who was 60 years old when she, and that's Rebekah, bore them being Esau and Jacob. Esau was the oldest, Jacob the youngest, but they were twins, so they were born at the same time when Isaac was 60 years old. We read then that Jacob says to Pharaoh when he arrives in Egypt at the end of the second year of the famine, Jacob says to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. And notice, just as an aside here, in Jacob's mindset, his entire life up to this point, this 130 years it's taken him to get here, even though he hasn't spent a day in Egypt, he's regarded all of that period as sojourning. Again, verifying our interpretation previously. Then when we're looking at this 400 or 430 years and talking about sojourning, that's the way these patriarchs viewed that. God had made promises to them of a land. They understood that, but they understood those promises had not been delivered yet by God, and therefore they were still sojourning in a land that was not theirs. So coming back, Jacob says to Pharaoh, I'm now 130 years old. So piecing all of this together, if Isaac was born in 1846 BC, 400 years before the Exodus, that would mean then Jacob was born in 1786 BC, 60 years later. And he arrived in Egypt then in 1656 BC, 130 years after this period, when he was 130 years old. And so again, we have then the period or the start of the arrival in Egypt, that being 1656 BC. The Exodus, as we've seen, was in 1446 BC. So again, the time in Egypt, it was exactly 210 years, from 1656 BC when Jacob arrived until the Exodus in 1446 BC. And again, if we look at our chart, we can see this particular these points that we've raised cropping up on the right, and we reach down to this pivotal point when Jacob arrives and meets Pharaoh in the second year of the famine in 1656 BC, and that then gives us this time period that the children of Israel were actually in Egypt. So when Joseph was to our sea and Jacob arrived with the rest of the children of Israel through to the Exodus was only 210 years. And if you at this point are still grappling with the reading of those 400s and 430 years, I'll bring you to one other point a little bit later, and we will, let's say, put the final nail in the coffin of any thoughts you still might have about 400 or 430 years, and we will prove from Scripture categorically that it is absolutely 100% impossible for the time period from the time Jacob arrived to the Exodus to ever be 400 years. But we'll come to that a little bit later. So our next thing that we wanted to look at, point 2, was when was Joseph born? And we're really just looking at the events and that take place in this little circle that I've drawn here. So after Isaac's born, right down to the migration to Egypt when Jacob arrived there. So first off, we need to pick up a very important part of Jacob's life. And we know that from Genesis chapter 29 and verse 23 to 25, that Jacob serves Laban 7 years for Rachel. So he sees Rachel, he wants Rachel for his wife, and Laban says to him, you can have Rachel as your wife, but you have to serve me 7 years to earn her. On his wedding night, I can only presume that for somehow, and I think this was Laban's doing, Laban got Jacob horribly drunk on his wedding night, and somehow in that state, he ends up marrying Leah, and when he wakes up in the morning, Leah's lying next to him as his wife. He obviously must have been absolutely livid that he'd been deceived, and obviously goes off to see Laban. And the deal struck then at that point, because he still loves Rachel and still wants to marry her. And the deal there is that he will be given Rachel a week later. So he's just got married to Leah. He's allowed to, or forced to, consummate his marriage with Leah for a week, and then he has given Rachel as his wife. He has a further wedding ceremony, marries Rachel, but for Rachel, he has to work now a second 7-year period. So in other words, that first 7-year period in effect was for Leah, and now he has to work a second 7-year period for Rachel. But at this point in time, he is married to both Leah and Rachel, and he's fully allowed to obviously start having children with both of them. And so we read, complete the week of this one. So that's that first week of his marriage to Leah, and I will give you the other also, that being Rachel. In return, you have to serve me a further 7 years. Now, the next point we pick up in Genesis chapter 30 and verse 25, and this is quite important. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I might go to my own home and country." Now, Jacob would not have been allowed to ask this of Laban, nor would Laban have agreed to it, if Jacob still owed some of that 7 years he was working for Rachel for. So the 7 years had to have come to an end. Furthermore, I don't see Jacob carrying on working beyond the 7 years if he didn't need to. So I think we can conclude from this particular verse is that Joseph was born pretty much at the exact date, give or take, at the end of the second 7-year period that Jacob worked for Laban for Rachel. That's when Joseph is born. And the verse then is telling us that all 11 children from Reuben, the oldest, born first to Leah, all of those 11 children, excluding Benjamin, who's born much later to Rachel, and she dies in childbirth, all 11 of those boys are born in the 7-year period that Jacob spends serving Laban for Rachel. And we can only assume, obviously, that Reuben is conceived probably in that first week of consummating that marriage to Leah. And so we find that over the next 7 years, all of these children are born. And we're going to look at how this is possible. What we also pick up is that at this point, Jacob agrees to work a further 6 years. So he's done the first 2 lots of 7, 14 years. He agrees to work a further 6 years for the flock. And he says there, these 20 years, this is at the end of doing that, I've been in your house, I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, total of 20 years. Jumping ahead again to Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, we read, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. So we are now 17 years since Joseph was born. Remember, he spent 6 years serving for the flock, so this is now 11 years since he's left Laban, and Joseph is now 17 years old. And bear in mind that Reuben, the oldest, is only just over 6 years and maybe 3 months older than Joseph, and we'll look at this just now. Furthermore, we're told that in Genesis chapter 41, verse 46, that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So after working for Potiphar, getting thrown into jail, interpreting the servants' dreams, finally being remembered by them, being called out to interpret Pharaoh's dream, interpreting it correctly as the 7 years of prosperous and crops and 7 years of famine and leanness, Pharaoh decides to make Joseph 2RC, and this, at that point in time, Joseph is now 30 years old. So we've gone 13 years since he was pasturing the flock with his brothers, and he's now 13 years later, he's become 2RC to Pharaoh. At this point, we have then the 7 years of plenty. We move into the famine. We have 2 years of famine. And we read then Genesis 45, verse 6, for the famine had been in the land these 2 years. So we enter the second year of the famine. And if we take into account the 7 years of plenty plus the 2 years of famine before Jacob arrives, those 9 years, the 7 plus 2, add those on to Joseph's age of 30. And so Joseph, at the point at which Jacob arrives in Egypt with his other sons, Joseph is 39 years old. And you recall Jacob was 130 years old. So Joseph's 39 years old, and Jacob said to Pharaoh, I'm 130 years old. We established, obviously, that Jacob arrived in Egypt at the age of 130 years in 1656 BC. And so going backwards from 1656 BC by 39 years, we get that Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born, and that took place in 1695 BC. And obviously, if we go even further backwards, the 14 years for the 2 lots of 7 that he served for Leah and for Rachel, it means that Jacob was 77 years old when he started working for Laban. And we often don't realize how old Jacob actually was when all of this took place. And so again, if we lay this out on a graph, we can begin to see how these things fit together. It's something you might want to study sort of on your own. We haven't got time to spend too much time looking at this. And we can now begin to focus and spend some time just looking at what transpired in that critical 7-year period when Jacob was working that second 7 years for Rachel, leading up to the point when Joseph was born, right at the end of that 7-year period. And as I said to you, the 11 of those sons from Reuben all the way through to Joseph were born to Jacob in that 7-year period. And it might be something you haven't really noticed when reading scripture, because unless you actually sit down and piece these things together, we often tend to just miss some of this detail. But just look at the facts we've been given. Jacob works 7 years for Rachel, but he gets given Leah at the end of that 7 years. Then he works, then a week later, he's given Rachel. During the course of the next 7 years, while working for Rachel, he has 11 children from 4 different women. This means that the maximum age gap between Reuben, the firstborn, and Joseph, the lastborn in that 7-year period, is around 6 years and maybe 3 months. So if Leah gave birth to Reuben after 9 months from the start of their marriage, there would have been 3 years plus the remaining 6 years. So at best, about 6 years and 3 months is the absolute maximum between the oldest child of Jacob and Joseph. But notice that Leah has 4 boys, then gets Zilpah to have 2, and then has a further 2. So 8 boys are born pretty much one after the other. Granted, there can be some overlapping between Leah and Zilpah, but 8 boys in a period of 7 years. And it also appears as if Leah had just had Judah by the time Naphtali was born, as we see in Genesis chapter 30 and verses 8 to 9. And this particular picture that you see of these different children really encapsulates, I believe, the ages of the children. And when I look at this drawing, and I wonder whether the artist who actually drew this was aware of how accurate he was depicting in this kind of cartoon, how accurately he was depicting the age differences between all of those children. So remember again, we have Leah, who has 6 boys plus a daughter, Dinah. So I believe those in blue on the left of that drawing, that's Leah in the background, and we're looking at 6 boys, probably Reuben, the sort of slightly taller, chubbier boy with the striped clothes on. He's the biggest, and he's probably around about nearly 6.5, 7 years old. And you've got 5 other brothers there, and then the little person being held by one of the brothers in a sort of purple sort of blanket, I think is Dinah. So you've got 6 boys plus the daughter Dinah. You've then got in the middle in the red Jacob and Rachel, and that in the sort of orange blanket there would be Joseph, just been born after that 7 years. And then you've basically got Bilhah and Zilpah, each having 2 boys, and that's in the green and the yellow. But again, this important thing is that we often tend to think of Reuben and many of the brothers of Joseph as being much older, like in their 20s or 30s, when Joseph was only 17. Whereas in fact, Reuben was no more than 23 and a half max, 23 maybe in 3 months old when all of this took place. So we will see now that this can actually be possible for all of these boys to actually be born to these 4 women in the 7-year period. And I think it goes something like this, bearing in mind that each pregnancy is 9 months. There could have been some of them where maybe they were slightly premature, closer to sort of 8 months, I'm not sure. But assuming just 9 months, what I've done here is take a red line, as you can see. So that's the full 7 years from 1702, when Jacob married Leah, and a week later was given Rachel, all the way through to 1695, when Joseph was born at the end of that 7-year period. And so you have Leah having those first 4 boys. During the time that she had the sort of second 2, Rachel gives Bilhah, and so 2 further boys are born, Dan and Naphtali. Then you've got Leah, who suddenly stops having boys. She gets Zilpah to have 2 sons by Jacob, that being Gad and Asher. And then obviously she falls pregnant again with Issachar and Zebulun at that point. And round about the time that Leah's probably still pregnant, hasn't quite given birth to Zebulun, Rachel finally falls pregnant with Joseph, and he is born at the end of the 7-year period. So again, quite possible that this could have occurred. What's interesting to note here is just the age gap between Levi. So Levi would have been born roughly 4.5 years before Joseph. So he's only about 4.5 years older than Joseph. And this will be important in the next thing that we're going to look at. And this is to do with that, what I've termed the final nail in the coffin. If there's anybody still hankering after a 400 or 430 year period from Jacob to the Exodus, let's just put that one to bed once and for all. And so just using these 2 passages, they tell us an enormous amount about what is and isn't possible. So the first is Exodus chapter 6 and verse 16. And we told you, these are the names of the sons of Levi, and you can follow the specific sons I'm looking at in that sort of vertical column, and I have highlighted them in red. So we've got, these are the sons of Levi according to their generations. Levi had Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The years of the life of Levi being 137 years. So Levi lived to the age of 137, and he had those 3 sons. Looks like the middle one is Kohath. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Issachar, Hebron, and Uzziel. The years of the life of Kohath being 133 years old. So he lived almost the same length of time as his father Levi, but in his case only 133 years. Amram then took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. The years of the life of Amram being 137 years. So he lived to be exactly the same age as his grandfather Levi. So we have Levi having Kohath, having Amram, having Moses. We then jump to Genesis chapter 46 and verses 8 to 11, and we read there, now these are the names of the descendants of Israel, of Jacob, who came into Egypt. So these are the ones that were already born and alive coming into Egypt. And remember, there were 70 of them that came in. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So we're told that Levi comes in, and Kohath, as probably the middle son, is alive and already born when they arrive with Jacob into Egypt. Now, you recall that we said that at most, Levi was 4 to 5 years older than Joseph. Joseph, we established a little while back, was 39 years old when Jacob arrived. And so that would make Levi in the region of about 43.5 years old at this point in time. Definitely old enough to have had Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So that makes sense. Kohath, however, we know from this passage was obviously already born because he was recognized as arriving into Egypt. So at most, Kohath had to be maybe a year old, because Merari was born after him, but give or take, that's the sort of youngest he could be. Moses, we told, was 80 years old when they left Egypt. So when the Exodus took place, Moses was 80 years old. So just as an example to show you that time period that we established previously of 210 years is quite feasible with what the information we've got here. If, for example, Kohath was born just prior to them arriving in Egypt, and he was 65 years old when he had Amram, and Amram himself was also 65 years old when he had Moses, and Moses, we know, was 80 years old when the Exodus took place. Then we would have 65 years from the birth of Kohath to Amram, 65 years from Amram to Moses, plus the 80 years, and we're going to end up with a feasible 210 years. So we can see this is very reasonable. And can quite easily tie in with the 210 years that we looked at. But notice what can't happen is that if we go and take the absolute maximums that are possible. So if Kohath arrived and was literally born the day before Jacob arrived in Egypt, and he had Amram on his deathbed, so as he died, as Kohath died, Amram was born. That would mean Amram was born 133 years, the full lifespan of Kohath, after Kohath had been born. If the same thing happened with Amram, in other words, Moses and Aaron were born on Amram's deathbed when he was 137 years, plus the 80 years that Moses, the age Moses was when the Exodus took place, the absolute maximum that we can ever generate with the figures that Scripture has given us is a time period of 350 years. And we know that that's highly unlikely that both Kohath and Amram had their sons, because they had other sons before and after that, that was right on their deathbed. But the absolute maximum we could get would be 350 years. So straight away, it's the final nail in the coffin. We cannot have a period of 400 or 430 years as being the time frame from Jacob arriving in Egypt to the Exodus. So hopefully we've closed the door on that one and finished the subject. So lastly, then we're going to come to our final point. We're going to look at Joseph and the Hyksos. And we know from our talk 2 and history that the Hyksos were defeated by Amos in 1557 BC, and Amos then went about reuniting all of Egypt, both upper and lower. So upper here in this map is the green area. That's your sort of native Egyptians, natural Egyptians. The yellow portion, the lower Egypt, being the lower Nile, was the sort of Hyksos-controlled area during this period. And so once Amos came and expelled the Hyksos, defeated them and got rid of them out of Egypt, this then became known in that bottom big red arrow on the left-hand sort of graph as the 18th dynasty. And this then concluded a period of 250 years in which Egypt had been split into two, with the Hyksos having moved into, as I said, lower Egypt, shown in that upper map, incorporating the Nile Delta, and then them slowly controlling this region, starting around about 1807 BC. So the Hyksos only really started filtering into and migrating into Egypt around 1807 BC, and slowly over that 250-year period. And that's a long period of time, 250 years. But slowly over that period of time, they slowly began to dominate the lower Egypt area. But this 250-year period from 1807 through to 1557 was a period made up of a 150-year period, known as the 14th dynasty, that sort of top section. And during this period, there were a number of Hyksos clans and tribes, I guess you could call them. And obviously with each clan or tribe. They each had their own particular tribal or clan leader. And all of these clans and tribes slowly rose and began to control various parts of Lower Egypt. So they came with particular skills and probably from a trading perspective and just general leadership, etc. And it enabled them, in and amongst the natural Egyptians at the time, to slowly rise up and take more and more control of Lower Egypt. But the thing to notice, and this is important, is that during this first 150 years, this control that they exercised over Lower Egypt through all these different clans and their different leaders was a fragmented but collective control. So fragmented in that there were a range of different leaders, but a collective because they actually worked together with a common goal and purpose. But all of that changed in 1657 BC, as we can see from the graph. And it was a year that was so significant that it led to history recording this as a change from, in terms of the Hyksos side, the sort of yellow side, a change from the 14th dynasty to the 15th dynasty in Lower Egypt, and from the 13th dynasty to the 16th dynasty in Upper Egypt. That was in the sort of green area. And so what occurred here? What led to this such a significant change that it affected both the Hyksos controlled area and the native natural Egyptian area to, in other words, change dynasties? And what occurred here was that there was a single Hyksos leader during this period who arose and assumed control over the entire Lower Egypt as Pharaoh. So where there had been this fragmented, a whole series of different of leaders of these different clans and tribes, one Hyksos Pharaoh rises up and assumes control over all the others, and significantly having sufficient influence to cause significant changes also in Upper Egypt, in the sort of natural native Egyptian side. And this then became the start of the 100-year period until their defeat and expulsion by Ahmose in 1557 BC. So it's only during this second period, this period of 100 years, that we find, and it's more when we move into the 17th dynasty, that we find things starting to change. And where there had been this amicable relationship between the Hyksos-dominated area in the sort of Lower Egypt and the Egyptian, natural Egyptian Upper Egypt, they'd been amicably able to work together for 150 years. Once we move into the second 100-year period, they started out like that, but with time, that relationship slowly broke down. And again, we'll see probably why this occurred, and it got more acrimonious as it went until there were skirmishes and fights and wars, ultimately leading to the natural Egyptians finally defeating the Hyksos and expelling them in 1557. So again, what occurred here? Well, Joseph, we know, arrived in Egypt in 1678 BC as a 17-year-old boy, and we see that right up at the top. And immediately he ends up being and working for Potiphar. That doesn't go down too well. He ultimately ends up in jail. And finally, at the age of 30 in 1665 BC, he reveals the dream to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh makes him 2RC. We then have 7 years of plenty, which is the green portion of the graph, from 1665 BC to 1658 BC. And then the famine starts. 2 years into the famine, in 1656 BC, Jacob and his family arrive in Egypt, and they are told to settle in the land of Goshen. And Goshen was a prime spot, and Pharaoh didn't skimp when he looked after Joseph's family, and he gave Jacob and the other boys one of the best places to go and live. And we read there, the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. So Pharaoh chose the best piece of land for Joseph's family. But what does Joseph do with the knowledge of the 7 years of plenty and the coming 7 years of famine? Well, he stockpiles enormous quantities of food during the years of plenty in preparation for the lean years. He probably spent an enormous amount of money building massive barns and silos and warehouses to be able to store the excess food. It probably was quite easy to acquire that food. You can just imagine what's taking place in the market when you've got these massive years, just year in, year out, of just excessive plenty of crop. You literally can't give your crops away. And so if you've got somebody effectively gathering up the excess, you're taking away the excess that would cause the price of food to plummet. And so what Joseph was doing was taking away that excess and storing it and solving a problem for the farmers to keep them busy and planting again. Because otherwise, if they couldn't sell their crops because of the oversupply and not enough demand, they would stop planting, and that would defeat the object. And so it was important for Joseph to use his business ability that God would have given him to gather up the excess, keep the supply to match the demand, to encourage the farmers to continue to plant at the same levels, to give rise to this excess, so that there was this excess for Joseph to squirrel away and put into barns and silos. And so he stockpiles these enormous quantities of food ready for the lean years. And he does it over a 7-year period. And then he further uses that stockpile when the famine arrives to gain absolute control of the entire region, especially Lower Egypt, for his Pharaoh. And we read about this. So Joseph brought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was so severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. So you can see what's taken place. Once the famine bit in and they tried to plant, everything just died. There was no rain, and so their crops just died. And so they went from this 7 years of plenty where they didn't know what to do with the excess food. Joseph was obviously helped the supply and demand situation and took away the excess. But once the famine came, they didn't know what to do. They no longer had any crops. So within the first year, they had a problem. And so they came to Joseph because they knew he had all of this food. And the first thing he did was say, you're going to have to buy this food. And they had to buy it using their land. And what's the point of having land if you can't grow any crops on it? So they were more than happy to give away their land to feed themselves for a period. But eventually they had no more land left. And so what else could they do? Give away their possessions, and finally they had to give away themselves and go into, in a sense, almost enslavement and work for Pharaoh. And so you could see how Joseph used the knowledge that he had, this insider knowledge, almost insider trading, as we'd call it in modern terms, to gain control of all of Egypt for his Pharaoh. So what did this do, this ability to have absolute control? Well, as you said, it enabled one Hyksos leader or Pharaoh to rise above all the others and take full control over all of Lower Egypt and rule out of avarice. And when did this occur? Well, it occurred 1 year after the famine had started, and that was in 1657 BC. And that was the start of the 15th dynasty. And so again, if we combine our different graphs together, we can see all of this detail occurring around this key date of 1657 BC. And that being right there 1 year before the second year of the famine. And so began this mutually amicable relationship between the children of Israel once Jacob had arrived and the Hyksos. And that would have continued for literally the next 100 years until the Hyksos were finally defeated by Upper Egypt, led by Amos in 1557 BC. And that's when we read, that there was this new king that arose who did not know Joseph. This Ahmose was a natural Pharaoh Egyptian from down south in Upper Egypt. Obviously, they had built up this hatred for the Hyksos, probably a lot to do with the way things were run after that critical period when the famine started, and they were forced themselves to probably have to sell a lot of the things that they had to buy food. And I don't think that giving up that kind of control went down too well with them, and slowly that would have deteriorated the relationship that a fairly amicable relationship they had for the first 150 years with the Hyksos. And so it slowly went south and it built into eventual skirmishes and fights and war until finally Ahmose managed to defeat the Hyksos. And so in arriving from the south, from Upper Egypt, and coming in and taking over Lower Egypt, in which the children of Israel were now living, and the Hyksos had run off and been expelled, Ahmose didn't know the children of Israel. And he didn't know anything about Joseph. That was 100 years ago. So again, we can probably assume maybe in terms of doing all this work for Pharaoh that maybe Joseph hadn't really had many friendly dealings with the Egyptians from south. But the children of Israel, because of their very close relationship that they'd had with the Hyksos over this period, would have naturally been viewed in the same light as the Hyksos, and therefore feared because of the likelihood of them siding with the Hyksos should they ever decide to invade Egypt and try and take back what they once had. And so when we read passages like this in Exodus chapter 1, these little details suddenly make so much more sense now that we understand the history behind them. And we can see how the Egyptians would have feared the children of Israel because of that relationship, supplying extra manpower should there be a fight with the Hyksos coming back. So now that we've looked at the accuracy of the scriptural record and how it not only ties in with the historical and archaeological record, but we also see how it is in fact able to fill in missing pieces and explain why certain events in fact actually occurred. And so we can take great comfort from the accuracy of God's word, but we mustn't just look at the accuracy of the past record. We need to take cognizance and comfort that the future predictions will likewise be just as accurate. And so when we look at the central figure in the accounts we've just considered, it's not the Hyksos Pharaoh, but rather the man that God chose himself, and that was Joseph. And look at what we read in Psalm 105 and in verses 16 to 22. When he summoned a famine on the land and broke all the supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters, his neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him, the king sent and released him, the ruler of the people set him free, and made him lord of his house and ruler of all of his possessions, to bind his princes at his pleasure, and to teach his elders wisdom. And where we stand today, we need to remember that Joseph was a type of Christ. Joseph was there to teach us about Jesus. And just look at some of the amazing and wonderful parallels that we see between the two. In both of them, they were God sent. They were loved by his father. Joseph was loved by Jacob. Jesus was loved by God. They were sent to his brothers. They were hated and rejected by them. They were sold for money. They were put in a pit, or in Jesus' case, a grave. They were delivered from there. They were raised up to glory, and they were made second in command. Joseph second in command to the Hyksos Pharaoh, Jesus second in command to God himself. But for what purpose? To become a preserver of life, to be recognized by his brothers, to bring deliverance and salvation. And so as we come to the end of this talk, I think we are in a position to confidently feel that in the very near future, when Jesus returns, we will stand together with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph to be welcomed into the glory which shall be revealed. Thank you.